Hello, my name is Crits on a Stick, and today I'm going to be doing a short tutorial on how you can create a room-to-room transition like the one you're seeing here. This will be taking place in GameMaker Studio 2, but hopefully the general principles and concepts will work with other game development engines. As you can see here, I have a demo game created with some very generic rooms and objects that we're going to work with. I have two rooms, each with a different background, and in each of these rooms I have a button object. And these are two different objects. We have room button 1 and room button 2. And right now the only thing that they do is when we click them, they take us to the other room. No transition, very, very basic in terms of code. And so the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to create an object that is going to function as our transition handler. And so I'm just going to go ahead and call this obj underscore transition, although you can call it whatever you would like. And we're going to go ahead and mark this object as persistent. Persistent means that when we switch rooms, the object will come with us. And later and this will be very important, and I'll be sure to explain it later, but right now, just make sure that you have the persistent checkbox checked. And the first thing that we're going to do with this object is go into the create event. And in the create event, we're going to set a couple of variables. First things first, we're going to have enter, set that to false, and change, and also set that to false. And what these do, these keep track of the state that our transition object is in. It'll make a bit more sense once all the code is in, but essentially we want to see if we need to change what part of our transition is running and if we have entered the new room that we're transitioning into. And so we're going to leave those like that for now. The next two variables that we're going to do is transition size, or I just typed trans size for me, and level. And transition size can be set to whatever. For if you want, I have mine set to 50. Level should be set to 0. And what transition size does is it controls how big the transition effect is. So really what you want is you want this number to be however big you need it to be in order to cover your screen or the camera that you're using. So in this example, I found that the number 50 works great, but if you have a smaller camera view, then maybe you'll want to do 30 or 40. And if you have a really large one, then you're probably going to want to do something like 60, 70, 80. It'll take a bit of trial and error, but for now, leaving it at 50 should be fine. The final two variables that we're going to have here is scaling, and I'm going to set that to 1 for now, and spacing, and I'm going to set that to 32. Scaling affects how quickly the transition effect happens. So for example, if you remember in the demo, we had a bunch of circles appear that slowly got larger. Scaling affects how quickly they get large. And in this case, the smaller the number is, the faster that size increase will happen. So if I set this to 10, they would fill very slowly and maybe not cover the entire screen in time. But if I set this to a decimal, then they would grow very fast and give us a black screen without much of an effect. Spacing determines how far apart each of those effects are. So in this case, this number is in pixels. And so each of those circles, when they're created, are 32 pixels apart from the others. And that affects both the x distance and the y distance. So I'm just going to type a few comments and notes here for you, and then once that's done, we're going to move on to the draw object or draw event. Okay, with these comments out of the way, we're ready to move on to the draw event. So we're going to come over here, add event, draw. And I'm going to zoom out the screen a little bit, just because there's going to be a bit more code that we're going to be writing here. So this is where all the work for the transition happens. And to start, we need to declare a couple of local variables. The first one will be cam_x, and the second one will be cam_y. And we're going to set each of these equal to the view x and the view y, respectively. And this is important to make sure that wherever we draw the effect, it will happen on screen. Specifically, it'll begin at the top left screen, part of the screen, or the view, and go on from there. And now, when you're doing your transitions and as you customize it, you don't have to set it to the top left. You could have this be the middle of the screen or the bottom right corner of the screen. But whatever you set it to, that is where the transition will begin. And so that's just something that you'll want to keep track of. And the last thing that I'm going to do real quick is set the draw color to black, so that way we have a nice black transition screen. This can also change depending on what you're going for. And now that that's out of the way, we are going to get into the meat of this, the main chunk of code. And to start with that, we are going to do an if-else statement. And within this if-else statement, we're going to see if enter is not true. If you remember, in our create event, enter is set to false right away. So this part of the if-else statement will fire immediately. And what this if-else statement does is it divides our transition into two parts. The part that is run immediately when our transition object is created, and then the second part will run whenever we set enter to true. And inside this first part of the if statement, we're going to go ahead and create a for loop. Just a basic for loop, nothing too special here. Although one thing to take note of is we are going to set this for loop to where I is lesser than or equal to level. And so going back to our create event, there we go. Going back to our create event, we keep level set to 0. However, this keeps track of how far into the transition we are. And so what will be happening here is this will run more and more times as we get farther and farther into the transition. And that will happen thanks to this if-else statement that we're going to write down here. We're going to check to see if level is greater than or equal to transition size. And if it's not, then we want to increase the level by 1. You could theoretically have the level increase by more if you wanted the transition to be faster, but for now we're just going to set it to 1. And so what this does is, first time around, we will run this loop once. And then the level will be increased again, and then it'll be twice, and 3 times, 4 times, etc., etc. Which means the longer, as this code continues to run, until it hits that transition size, which is how big we want the transition, it'll keep on running that. And we're going to leave this part blank for now. I'll come back to that in just a second. For now, let's fill out our for loop, our nested for loop. And for here, we're going to set j equal to 0. And for this nested loop, we're going to compare j to the transition size. So unlike the outer for loop, where this will continually run more and more times, this inner one will always run the same amount of times, which in our case is 50. And then we're going to increase that. And inside this for loop, we're going to have a draw circle event. And this draw circle event is what draws the effect. And so to fill this in, For the x value, we're going to set camera x or cam x, and then add spacing times j. And then for the y value, we're going to do cam y plus spacing times I. I'm going to make sure that's a plus. Then for the radius, in parentheses, we want level minus I, and then we're going to divide that by scaling. And for the radius, or filled, I forget what it's referred to as, but we're going to set this to false so that way our circles are filled in and not just outlines. Now to explain the code. We're going to start with the draw circle. If you remember from the demo, the transition example that I used circles that got larger over time and also, filled in more of the area. And that's what this spacing times j and spacing times I is for. As we continue to go through this first loop, the circles will be drawn more and more to the right, towards the right of the screen. And as we continue to go through on this outer for loop, they continue to get drawn closer and closer to the bottom of the screen. And so you can think as this being what creates each column of the transition, and this creates each row of the transition. And of course, both of these correspond with transition size. And so depending on how large this is, that'll affect how much of the screen is covered by the transition. And at this point, we're just about ready to start running our code. There's just a couple more things that I almost forgot to add. The first one of which is we want to set change to true. If you remember in our create event, it starts off at false, but when our level reaches the transition size that we have set, we want to set change to true. And there's one other important thing that I forgot. I'll admit this isn't maybe the most elegant way of doing this, but at least for this demo, we want to set the depth of this object on creation to -1,000, for example. This ensures that the transition will be drawn over any objects or any other sprites that we have on the screen. And so with that out of the way, let's go to our room button. And as you can see, this is from earlier. We've commented out our room go-to, and instead we have our instance create layer, X, Y, and layer. They can just be set to be the same as the existing object, and we'll be creating our transition handler. And so if you think about it this way, we click on the button, the transition handler is created, and then immediately the variables are set, and we run this first part of the loop. So with that explanation out of the way, our code. And as you can see here, I have my room with the button in it, and when I click the button, the transition happens. We get a blank screen, or at least half of the transition happens. We still need to code in the second part, along with the part that actually takes us to the next room. But as this first part is working just as intended, and the second part is, well, essentially the same. I'll go ahead and code up the second part and then go into a code explanation. All right, I have the second part of the for loop all coded up, and thankfully for all of us, it's very similar to the first part, just with a few different variable changes. The first thing to take note of is our outer for loop, and that is the fact that I is set to level max, and then for the check, we have I is greater than or equal to 0, and we subtract I. Everything else on the inside is the same. Our column is the same, drawing the circle is the same. But yeah, this part of the loop is essentially reversed from what we have up here. And that's because we want to draw the circles receding and disappearing from the screen rather than covering the screen. And similarly, this if statement, this if else statement from the first part is kind of reversed from the second one. For example, we check to see if the level is lesser than or equal to 0. And if it is, then we want to destroy our transition handler. We want to remove it. And then in the else statement, if that's not the case, then we want to slowly decrease the level by 1. Again, essentially the reverse of what we have in the first part. And now, with these loops out of the way, we're going to go back to working with our buttons and finish up all of the transition code. To start, we're going to go back to our button objects. For room button 1, we create the instance. However, now we're going to add a step event. Because if you remember, in transition for the first part, at some point we set the change variable to true. And that's something that we want to utilize. And so in our step event, first things first, we're going to see if we even have a transition handler around. So we're going to do if instance exists, object transition, and then inside of that, we're going to grab the ID of our transition handler. And for that, I just like to use instance nearest xy, then object transition. And I just realized I forgot to put that in an if statement. So if the nearest, or hopefully only, transition handler has change set to true, then I can just copy some code from over here. We want to go to the next room. And so what will happen is we click this, we create a transition object, it goes through all of its stuff until change is equal to true, and then, assuming that it does exist, we go to the next room. Now, the last thing that we need to do, there's actually two things. The first one is we're going to go ahead and copy over our code to our second button object. It's very simple. The only thing that you need to do is make sure you change the room that the room go to is set. So in this case, we want button 2 to take us to room 1. And then, of course, copy the code from our click event, comment out that, paste it there. And there we go. Our 2 buttons are set up. So now clicking these buttons will take us between the rooms. The last thing that we need to do is in our transition object. If you remember, we're always going to run this because enter is false. We need something that sets enter to true. And so how we're going to do that is in the other category. We're going to use a room start event. And in this, we're going to set change equal to true or false, and enter equal to true. So change equals false, enter equals true. And what this does is this setting change to false prevents our room buttons from attempting to go to the next room. We'd have a really weird back and forth loop between the rooms if we didn't set change to false. And setting enter to true, well, that makes sure that we run the second part of our code. And so to run through the whole thing, we'll start here. We click a button that creates a transition object. It runs through the first part of the code, change is set to true, back to the first room button. Because change is true, we go to the next room. When we go to the next room, change is set to false, enter is set to true, and then with enter being set to true, we run the second part of the transition, which, because it's essentially a reverse of the first one, removes the transition from the screen. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and run our program and see how. As you can see here, we're in the first room with our button 1, and we click it, the transition happens, and as we enter the second room, the transition goes away. And clicking this button does the same thing. So there you go. Hopefully this code helps you out and you can implement transitions into your own game. Now, I just wanted to show a quick example from the video game that I'm working on as how I'm using this transition code. Now, my code is a lot messier as, my video game was the first place I implemented it, but I just wanted to point out something that I really like about this system, and that is how customizable it can be. Right here, I have an admittedly messy switch statement. Um, if you'll pardon the messiness of all of this and the function and all that, you'll see I have here a very similar draw circle event that we used in our demo. But then in another part, I have a draw sprite extended. You can see I have all this stuff here kind of detailing what I want to have happen. Um, what this means is rather than needing to use a circle or a built-in shape, if you use draw sprite extended and then, if you make sure that you draw it in black, you can use any shape of your choice for your transition. And so I'll go ahead and open up uh, my sprite. And there it is. You can see here, I just have this simple black diamond that I'm currently using for my transition. And if I boot up my game real quick, you can see that um, when I go to the right side of the screen, diamonds fill in, then diamonds go out. Yeah. Um, sorry, this isn't. I don't really have any kind of script or notes for this part, but I just wanted to point that out where this can be very flexible. You can change how the spacing is. If you're drawing a sprite, or if you're using the draw sprite extended, you can change things like the alpha or the transparency of the transition. You can change the rotation of it and color if you really want to do something fancy. Um, so yeah, hopefully this is all helpful to you guys. So yeah, that's the tutorial. Um, I decided to go ahead and make it because as I was trying to look up like tutorials and other references for how to do a transition for my own video game, I couldn't really find anything that wasn't just a simple like fade in and out. And well, I wanted something a little more creative. So hopefully this video is helpful for you. Um, hopefully you can make some nice, cool transitions in your game. And yeah, thanks for watching, I guess. Don't know if I'll do any other tutorial videos like this in the future, but guess we'll have to see. So yeah, see you next time.